Hey there, folks. Welcome to Head, Heart, and Hustle, the podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Alan Plummer, and as always, I want to thank you for listening. Anyone with a side hustle or creative outlet can feel isolated from their friends, their family, and others around them who just don't get their passion. And that's why Head, Heart, and Hustle exists, to help you feel motivated, learn, and just get a nice pick-me-up of creative energy from other people like yourself. Every episode, I interview an individual who doesn't just pretend to be creative. They've rolled up their sleeves and are producing great things because they need to. They know that being creative is part of who they are. Sound familiar? Awesome. You're in the right place. Now, today, I'm with Chris Spurvey. Chris is a consultant in Newfoundland, up in Canada, who teaches basically business owners and entrepreneurs how to build a personal brand and effectively sell. Now, that may seem a bit out of character for the podcast. Okay, so you're sitting there thinking, well, Chris isn't an artist. He's not a musician. He's not a writer. Chris is, in fact, a creative individual. He runs his own podcast. He's starting a second podcast. He has written a book, and he is absolutely an expert on personal branding. One of the reasons I wanted to get Chris on the podcast is because for a lot of artists and creatives, I know that there can be struggles around positioning ourselves as a talented creative and trying to make money at our art or our creativity. And I'll admit that even for myself, sometimes it feels a bit dirty to try to monetize what we do for a living and try to actually think of it as an income, as if somehow that would cheapen what we actually do and love. So with that said, I thought Chris would be a great person to talk to about what that's like for artists and how we as artists and creatives can be a little more comfortable around offering our value up to the world and why we should feel good about what we do and what we create. And yes, as artists and creatives, we absolutely should think of ourselves as personal brands. So I think this one's going to be helpful for everybody who listens and who creates something. So let's dive in. Chris, thank you for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm so appreciative of your time and grateful for you having me on your show.
Yeah, thank you. Well, one good turn deserves another. You were kind enough to chat with me for your own podcast a couple weeks back, and I thought, all right, you know what? Let's get you on mine, and kind of trade notes a little bit. But yeah, let's start. As you know, I like to have everybody kind of introduce themselves and talk a little bit about who they are and what they do. So why don't we just start there?
Sure, sounds good. Well, yeah, I can jump right in there. My name is Chris Spurvey, and you can find me online at chrisspurvey.com. That's obviously CHRISSPURVEY.com. That's my website. In terms of what do I do? Well, I like to say I teach business owners, professionals, and entrepreneurs the profitable action steps for building an engaging personal brand and finding and connecting with ideal prospects, and then using social strategies to kind of sell with ease, I'll say. So, because a lot of people think sales is this really negative word, and so I help people gain confidence in the area of sales. So, and this has been a journey I've been on now for the last number of years as I began to grow my own personal brand, which kind of dovetailed when I decided to write my book. And I can tell you more about that story, but that's essentially what I do. But happy to share lots of bits and pieces of the journey.
Yeah. So I do want to come back to the book and the podcast and that evolution. But one of the things I want to jump into first is kind of this idea of teaching people around sales. And as I said to you before we started, a lot of our listeners are artists and creatives, and a lot of them are really adept at creating wonderful things. But understandably, especially if you're an artist, there may be some discomfort with the idea of, quote, selling, unquote. Or people don't think of things in that sense. What kind of guidance and advice do you have given when you work with people like that who don't necessarily start out as a natural seller, or in your experience have to kind of move into that or kind of get comfortable with some of those aspects?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question, and I can kind of take it from a high level on down. I mean, I guess first and foremost, like you kind of acknowledged, sales has some negative connotations to it, and I think that's primarily due to the image many of us have in our minds of what we think sales is. I recall in the early 1980s having the Electrolux vacuum cleaner salesman knock on our door, and my mom and dad being kind of forced to buy a vacuum for $3,000, which in today's dollars is around 12,000. And then they thought about the purchase for 2 or 3 months as they tried to figure out how to pay for it. So that was the image of sales I had on the screen of my mind. And when it came time for me to sell myself and sell my ideas and my products, that's the image I had. So therefore I failed miserably. And, because of the negative connotation and the lack of confidence that I could be that type of person. And so, I really believe that every one of us have unique gifts. We have unique strengths. And, if you're an artist and you're very creative, well, you know what, at its core, what you're creating can truly bring positivity and light and solve problems for potential people who consume what you create. And, if you look at it through the lens of solving a problem or being of service to a potential client, then, you're really doing a disservice to them if you don't get out there and share, right, and serve. And so I guess what I kind of like to say is we need to reframe. We just need to finally, once and for all, reframe what this whole thing of sales is in our minds. And then if we reframe it, we can go about it with a whole lot more confidence. And like I said, you're doing a disservice to people if you're not sharing yourself and get your unique gifts and strengths, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit on a key thing there. One of the things that it's really easy to overlook when you're a creative individual or an artist is the fact that you have an innate skill or skill set that a lot of people don't have, right? Whether you're a writer or a photographer or an illustrator, there's everybody, I think, who creates things. Obviously, you want to create stuff that you can share. You want to share what you create. So I think that's very organic and natural for a lot of artists. But there's something around that monetization that feels uncomfortable. And I don't know if it does for everybody, but it always seems to. And I think your point is really well taken to say, hey, recognize and acknowledge the fact that your skills are valuable, and that, to your point, you're providing a need for somebody who can't do what you do. And there's nothing wrong with expecting compensation for that. It's your time, it's your energy. Right?
It's your value. I mean, that's your life you're talking about. I mean, and life is measured in, while we're here anyway, it's measured in time, and we live in a world where time equals money to some extent anyway, or to a large extent, and therefore, why waste all your time doing things that are, in other words, you have immense worth, you have immense value, and so put a dollar amount on that value and ask for it.
Right, absolutely. So let's shift for a second and talk about personal brands. You've certainly got a personal brand yourself. You've been on that journey for several years now, and it's evolved quite a bit and grown quite a bit. A lot of artists may not necessarily think of themselves as a, quote, brand, unquote. I certainly don't. I'm just now starting to kind of think of myself that way. I've always kind of never really considered it. Can you talk a little bit about how that evolution occurred for you, and how that's impacted or been impacted by the more creative stuff you've done, like writing your book and like having your own podcast?
Yeah, I mean, if I think about my journey, and I do think we all have personal brands, and I guess you could also use the word professional brand, kind of interchangeable. We all have those brands, whether we have decided to elevate it and share it in kind of direct ways. We still have brands, and people see us in certain ways based on what we do and what we deliver. So, really personal branding is just about methodically going out there and, sharing yourself in a very proactive way so that when people are looking for a solution to a problem, they think of you, especially if you're aligned with that particular problem that they have, right? So the journey began for me really when I decided to write my book. Like I said, you could argue it began at birth, which it really did, but I decided to become proactive around my brand after I decided to write my book. And I was, I've never ever saw myself as creative as such. I never saw myself as a writer. However, when I decided to write my book and help people reframe through my book what sales is, because that's kind of the core concept of my book, I realized that if my mom and dad bought it, that's about it, because I didn't have a huge following. I didn't have a huge number of people lined up to buy what I wanted to sell them in terms of my book. So I decided to be more proactive about about it and just began to write and share articles on LinkedIn primarily. And then that blossomed into my podcast. And, if I kind of fast forward now 3 years, I launched a program in January where I enrolled 27 people in January and an additional 30 people a couple of months later. It's a program that teaches entrepreneurs and business owners and professionals how to sell and how to brand themselves. I had customers actually line up saying, Chris, I want what you have. I want to buy this from you. And I never had to sell them in the traditional sense. So that's what the benefits of a personal brand is that I say when you meet someone for the first time, if they've been consuming your brand, whether it's articles, podcast, or whatever, it almost feels like you're on second base. You bypass first base because they know you, and it's almost like they get a good feel for you without even having met you because they're consuming your content.
And does it feel like a lot of that? I think the one word that I think of as I hear you talk about that is authenticity, right? The ability to kind of truly be yourself and share and give, thoughtful answers and responses and insight and demonstrate that value before it even becomes a discussion about what you can do for them.
Yeah, I'm a real big believer in sharing the multidimensional sides of your personality through your brand, and that's the beauty of so many different platforms having different types of purposes and different. So, for example, I use Instagram. One of my most liked and shared pictures on Instagram is a picture I put up of my rotten, dirty garage, all full of stuff that we brought home from our cabin when we decided to sell our cabin. And I guess what that said to people when I posted that picture was that, hey, Chris Spurvey's a real guy. He's a guy with a dirty garage just like mine, right? And so, so I really believe that we should share our warts, so to speak, just as much as we share ourselves as experts, because that's more relatable. It's genuine. It's authentic. All those buzzwords we hear, but I just believe that that's what we should be doing. Now, I'm not suggesting you start videotaping a picture of you in a fight with your spouse.
Right.
Obviously, there's a line to draw somewhere. But if I look at some of the articles I wrote in my earliest days on LinkedIn, they're sharing stories about my daughter and when I picked up my daughter at her flute lessons, and she really listened to me as I had a really bad day, and I told her about that bad day, and she really listened. And I wrote an article about how I felt heard and felt a whole lot better. And so I brought the article around to how to effectively listen in the article. Another article I wrote was about my son championing how do I say that word? Championing a bicycle ride with a couple of his friends in our neighborhood, and how I watched them every morning lead this group of people, and how it grew and grew and grew, and so I titled the article "Celebrating Leadership." And so it's bringing that multidimensional side of my personality into the writing I do, the videos I do, the pictures I post, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And being holistic, which I love.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you mentioned early on that I absolutely think is true and completely agree with is this idea of being intentional. I learned myself several years ago that whether it's your professional life or your artistic life, if you don't intentionally frame yourself for other people and explain who you are and what you're good at and what you do, then people are left to kind of make up their own impressions and make up their own minds.
Yeah.
And so I think, to your point, that kind of intentional ability to frame and kind of, whether it's an elevator pitch or a description or what you offer or your skills, why leave that open to interpretation? And I think it's really easy for a lot of us to forget that that can be helpful.
And I think an important note on that is don't wait until you have all your I's dotted and T's crossed to start. So I may sound like I'm very intentional today, and you know what? I probably am. I'm far more intentional than I was 6 months or 12 months or 24 months ago. This started for me by posting an article about what I'm currently thinking my definition of success is back in 2014, and I didn't have any any intention outside of just saying, you know what, I'm going to start to share what my current thoughts are around subjects in personal development, and, moved it a little bit into sales and marketing and so on. And, I decided about a year ago, you know what, I'm going to start monetizing a bit more this platform that I've built. And so, it's an evolution, and there's every day I'm saying to myself, you know what, I'm not being intentional enough. I need to be more focused, and what I just try to do today is I just try not to let that questioning slow me down. It's like by just putting stuff out there into the universe, into the ether, you get signals of what's working and what's not, and you pivot around what's working, and you just make small little changes as you go, incremental changes. And what you'll look back after 2 or 3 years of doing this, and you'll be amazed at what you've created and where you are today versus where you were 3 years ago.
Yeah, and it's wonderful, that technology allows each of us to kind of do that without getting permission, right?
Yeah.
Because decades ago, you had to rely on mass media, or you could write a book and you had to, knock on the doors of publishers and go through that. And if you wanted to do a radio show, you had to get a station. All those limitations are gone now. It's wonderful.
Exactly.
So you joked about a post that you wrote a while back, and immediately my ears perked up because it's one of my favorite questions for people. You talked about how you define success. What is your kind of thoughts on that? What does that look like for you, and has that evolved over time?
The definition, well, I mean, yeah. So has it evolved over time? Absolutely. There was a time when I was extremely money motivated, so I equated success to money. Yeah, that's back in my graduating days of university, where I had all kinds of people. I received accolades because I was always the person who was an entrepreneur, and they said I had the golden horseshoe up my rear end type of thing. And so I latched on to that personality that because I was getting attention, and so I equated success with money. But I learned the hard way. I was at a point in my life in very early 2000s where I was spending more money than I was making because I thought I had to live up to that persona, that I was a successful person. And it resulted in 2003, where essentially my wife and I had to go and declare bankruptcy because I was so stupid with my money, right? And so that experience, I guess, led me to kind of sit and really think about my definition of success. And my son had been born, my daughter had been born that same year, and I guess I started to latch on to a few definitions that served me a whole lot better. So the definition of success that I presently really resonates with me, and it has for the last 5 years, is a definition I heard from Earl Nightingale, who is he's considered the dean of personal development by many. Success is the progressive realization of a worthy ideal. And I encourage anyone who heard that definition to really write it down and dissect every word within the definition, right? And so, and I can jam on it for 30 seconds, but I mean, the main thing is that an ideal is really a vision that you have for your life. So sitting down and thinking 2 to 3 years out, or even sooner, where you want to be, who you want to be, who you want to serve, and so have that vision written out. And so every day that you wake up and you can go to sleep saying, you know what, I've progressively realized that worthy ideal. I can celebrate some small wins where I'm serving my people, I'm also serving my family, and so on. The progressive realization. It's not a destination. It's not the arrival that you're celebrating. It's this, every day, those little small nuggets that you can say, you know what, I had a great day, and here's what I did today that moves me towards my ideal. That's success, right?
Yeah, and I love the fact that you include service. You're the first person I've spoken to who's given an answer to that question that includes the word service. I think a lot of people have meant that intention, but you're the first person to verbalize it, and I love that. Because the bottom line is that's really motivating long term when you kind of start to reap those benefits and see the impact you're having on other people. For me, right, when I look at this podcast and what I do outside of work, there's hours upon hours upon hours, as that you put into this stuff. But then when you start to see how other people consume it, and the fact that you're creating something that somebody else will spend 30 or 45 minutes consuming, that's, to your point, time is currency, right? And so if I'm creating this episode and somebody really wants to hear your thoughts and we're enabling them to spend 30 or 40 minutes hearing your thoughts on that you multiply that out and you do the math, and that's hours and hours and hundreds and thousands of hours of time.
Yes.
Yes. And it's right. And so then when I think about the time and energy I spend to create my podcast and my episodes, it feels like it returns tenfold.
Yeah, you got it. I love it. Yeah, so that's a great way to look at it.
And that,
right?
for me, when I'm working on the podcast at night after I put my son to bed and I'm tired, but I'm kind of grinding it out, that for me is what helps motivate me.
Right.
So I completely agree. I get that.
Yeah, like I really do. I really believe that this word, Earl Nightingale phrases it as an ideal. I love the word vision, and if you have a compelling vision for your life that is you being of service to your family, to the people that you serve, that's going to, and it's really juicy. It's bringing in all the senses. You can smell it, you can taste it, you can see it. And you sit down and you review that daily or listen to it daily. Really, what'll come out of that, a byproduct of having a solid vision like that, is self-motivation. And so hearing your story of during the night, I'm picturing you with the lamp on in a dark room.
Yes.
And you're tired, but you're pumping it out. That's self-motivation. That's persistence. And it's all those ingredients. Somewhere deep inside you is a vision, because you wouldn't be doing this if you never had that vision.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not glamorous, but it's the hard work that goes in behind the scenes. And I think all too often we as a culture don't celebrate that. And I think that's why so many of us early on in our lives are kind of romanced by the monetary rewards, because that's what they see. We don't talk about the hard work that goes into stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that said, you have a lot going on in your personal life. You talked about your children, you're married, you have a family, you have a job, you have a podcast, you've written a book. What kind of tips do you have for kind of juggling that stuff? How do you maintain these kinds of projects and still be a good dad and be a good spouse and kind of juggle all that stuff? What have you learned along the way in terms of that?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I've learned a ton. Let's just say that. So at its highest level, I would say that if you're out there and you're growing your brand and you're looking for ways to put yourself out there, I always say that we should try to focus on the energy of progress and less on the energy of numbers, right? So we can get stuck in balance sheets and income statements and all that sort of stuff, and start looking at that every single day. But it's really hard to, I think, put numbers on your personal brand, because you're doing it, and your personal brand is your personal brand, and so I like to focus, as I said, every evening before I go to bed, on celebrating a few small wins that particular day. So early when I began to grow my personal brand, it was I did get myself caught up in I wanted more likes, I wanted more comments, I wanted more shares, I wanted more followers, and I had to throw all that out the window and just focus on what I could do every single day to move the yardstick forward. And so as I've moved along, I've began to create processes that streamline, small things like creating a piece of content, like a podcast episode. A podcast episode for me is not just a podcast episode. It's also a video. It's also an article. So I leverage a virtual assistant who I've had a relationship with now for a couple of years. She's in the Philippines, and her name is Emerald. And we fine-tuned this process such that a podcast episode is multiple pieces of content, right? It's a quote card, it's the podcast, it's the video, it's the article, and I roll all that out in the week, over a 1 week period, and I cap it off with a newsletter that I send out to my list on Sundays. And so people look at me and say, Chris, how are you so productive? Well, behind the scenes, it actually only takes me like literally a half hour of time, and I don't want to make it sound too simple by saying that, but it's a process. I leverage technology. I upload things to Dropbox, and Emerald takes that, and for a few dollars, she's able to produce a whole pile of things for me. And so then how do I balance that? You know what? I schedule a couple of times a week. I use online calendar system where I block out 2 evenings a week where people can book podcast episodes with me. I leverage my lunch times as well. And, so my evenings are my family time. And, and a couple of times a week from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. I do podcast recordings. And so it works out to roughly for my personal brand, let's just say roughly 10 hours a week, which is not too bad, right?
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so that's kind of the Cole's notes or the overview of how I managed to do it. But it's been a work in progress. Just like I said, everything is. You kind of always have to have a mission of streamlining, and you know what, you don't want to turn this into much more than like for me, my vision is this being a lifestyle business. Yeah. So if I find myself too deep into it and I'm creating some monstrosity that's going to I'm thinking employees now. I'm thinking, that's not what the intention ever was, right? So I go back to the vision, I revisit the vision, and I resettle myself and say, okay, no, let's rebalance and go forward from here, right?
Yeah, and I think we talked about this a little bit when I was on your podcast. There's something to be said for being driven but yet flexible and kind of evolving. And there's a difference there. It's a fine line between being so laser focused that anything else is kind of noise versus kind of being open to kind of seeing how things evolve and learning from challenges and evolving, which absolutely helps.
Yeah, you got it. And one aspect I never touched on, though, is so a little bit about my story. I was leading sales, business development for an IT consulting company, and we grew it to roughly 70 employees. In January 2013, we were acquired by KPMG Canada, one of the larger advisory firms in the world. And so when we were acquired, I assumed the role of vice president of business development for KPMG Canada, covering the Atlantic Canadian provinces. So that's a big part of my life. And so the beauty, though, is that I've managed to weave it all together in such a way that KPMG get the benefit of me, Chris Spurvey, growing my personal brand, and I also get the benefit from it. So I believe that if we work things right and we surround ourselves with the right types of people who see the benefits of what you're doing, and you share that, and I think this is the same situation you're in. It's all one big puzzle, and can all work together.
Yes, right? And it makes me better at my day job, and I'm sure it does for you too, right? This podcast makes me better in my job as a marketer and my interactions with creatives and my role as a leader. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally. So, it's funny. You said you don't necessarily, or it sounded like you didn't consider yourself a creative person. You mentioned your daughter plays music. You had mentioned earlier on your wife is a teacher. So do you guys feel like you have a creative household? There must be elements of creativity there if your children have some creative outlets. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think the reality is that I come from a very highly creative family. Okay. My mom and dad are both musicians. They sing. My dad plays guitar. He plays multiple instruments. My sister is a flute player, and she's got her bachelor's of music, her master's of music, her doctorate of music. That's awesome. So very, very powerful flute player, and my other sister as well. And so I have a lot of creativity in my sort of family. At some point in time in my teenage years, I think I rebelled a little bit against that creative thing, and whether it was because my mom forced me to go to guitar lessons, which I wasn't enjoying, so I began to not label to sort of shun the label of being a musician, and so I gave up guitar, and then I went into university, and I was struggling a little bit with English, and when I say English, writing, and so I started to compare myself with friends who were naturally good writers. And you know what? In hindsight, I began to kind of write like them because that's what I thought I had to do to get good grades. And so I never ever saw myself as a writer. I actually labeled myself as a poor writer. And I remember with bosses in my past, I would say, I'm not a good writer. I write like I speak. And
no, that's the best. Not everybody can do that.
Well, you know what? That's what I've learned.
Yeah.
That's what I've learned. And so how I became a writer is I just started to write like I speak. And you know what? I surround myself with some people who can dot my I's and cross my T's, a copy editor, and all of a sudden I'm a writer. So you know what? That's the history I've got with creativity and writing. And I'm probably a lot more creative than I give myself credit for.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And it's funny, as a former professional writer, I can tell you it's extremely hard to write and make it sound and feel organic and conversational. It's really an art to it. So
absolutely.
And it makes sense. So, the rebelliousness thing, I totally get it, right? And whether you recognize it or not, I think there's an understanding to want to be your own person, right? It's part of being a teenager. And that I've heard other folks growing up in creative families who kind of have similar backgrounds. But that said, right, regardless of whether or not you are a musician, there is a difference in my mind between being an artist and a musician, or performing arts, or a truly liberal artist, like we think of, or what we think of when we say the word creativity, versus being someone who can create things, right? So what you did, whether or not you became an artist or a musician, you did grow up in a household that instilled in you that desire to create things, right? To restore balance, right? A lot of folks, clearly. When I think about people who struggle with creativity, it's people who've never had exposure to that. Because I do believe everybody has a creative aspect to them. But all too often, we, especially today, are focused on consuming. And I don't mean buying, but I mean watching movies and listening to music and even listening to podcasts. We take in. At some point, to get some balance, you've got to put stuff back out.
Right.
And I think it makes perfect sense that you're doing this stuff that you're doing now, because that's your version of the creativity that you were surrounded with as a child. I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, you nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. I mean, I got flashbacks going on in my brain here now that of my mom's. My mom had a huge influence on me, and some aspects of her personality. I mentioned the money, and there earlier in the podcast. She is a person who. Her personality is she kind of if you don't do certain things, she kind of tries to force you to do them, and so you rebel, right? The thing about she has the right intention behind it all, I mean, I think you're dead on, and both my parents set up environments where imagination and creativity were such important aspects, and independent thinking and making decisions, right? And so they supported us in those types of things. And, I recall, I don't know, like just think, I'm flashing back to me in my teenage years, imagining me as a guitarist in a heavy metal band, and I would play air guitar in my bedroom for hours on end by myself, right? But that's creativity. I'm imagining myself doing these things, and so I think what I'm doing today is I'm probably I'm feeling heard, right? So I'm putting my words out there, my podcasts out there, my videos out there, and all of a sudden, holy smokes, people are listening. This is, and so when I was younger, I rebelled because I kind of felt like I was forced to do some of this stuff. Yeah. But now all of a sudden, I'm feeling really free and clear, and I'm just being me, and people are listening, and it's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely, and that for me is part of success as a creative, is when you feel like you can be heard and you get to create stuff on your own terms. For folks that are professional creatives, there's a difference between kind of doing a job for money, which is not a bad thing, versus kind of having those true passion outlets. And man, when you can merge the two together and kind of make money off of doing what you truly love, to me, that's kind of like the icing on the cake in a lot of ways. Absolutely.
Love it.
Yeah.
Agree.
Yeah. Well, Chris, this has been wonderful. I appreciate this. I appreciate you taking time. My last question that I'll ask is really kind of any final thoughts or advice that you would have for our listeners, whether or not it's around kind of creative outlets that they have and some of the lessons you've had kind of doing the podcast and writing the books, or anything kind of along personal branding that you'd want to leave our listeners with.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I would suggest is that you sit down and personal branding. There's actually a roadmap that you can take, right? So in my opinion, it starts out by just identifying some things, some ideas that you want to share, and just doing it. But then moving from there into really starting to define your niche and who your ideal client is, or ideal follower or viewer or listener, however you want to define that. And I would encourage you not to let the fine tuning of that niche hold you back from continuing. And as you can tell, I've alluded to that a number of times, and that's because I have let the fine tuning sometimes hold me back from putting some stuff out there. And really what that is it's a bit of a form of self-sabotage, where I'm hitting a wall, and I'm allowing that questioning to kind of stall myself. And 3 months go by and you haven't put a single thing out there. And what I've proven to myself is the more you put out there, the more you can kind of learn from that. So you define your niche as you go, and then you take a little bit of a strategy. I say one-to-one. One-to-one meaning you get out there and you talk to friends and family and people in your local network about what you're doing, and so you start to gain a few ambassadors, some advocates for what you're up to, and then start to scale it from one-to-one to one-to-many, where you're putting your blog and your podcast and your videos out there, and people, and have as your one thing I always say is, and this is, I'm very grateful. I don't know how I managed to stumble upon this, but someone told me very early, start a newsletter, start an email newsletter. So I, for 3.5 years now, I've produced a Sunday morning newsletter, and it's very simple. It's just a story or a tactic or a technique that enables people to progress their personal brands and sell with ease. And I've done it for 3.5 years, and so I've got a significant newsletter list now today. And the beauty of a newsletter list, and I'm sorry I'm rambling here maybe, but the beauty of a newsletter list is that with email, you can control to a larger extent, who's going to receive it and who's not. Yes, there's spam and all those types of things, and Gmail might put things in promo folders and that type of stuff. But the thing with Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, they've got algorithms behind them that you can't control, and some small change will turn your following from 30,000 into 300 overnight, just because of an algorithm change. So have as a base an email newsletter list, and then so that's kind of the one to many type strategies. And then moving from there, I say move to many to many, where you're really starting to grow a tribe. And so for me, when I look at my branding adventure, really January is when I began to move from many to many, where I launched my program. I created a community behind my brand that comes with the program that I offer. And so all of a sudden now I've had 60 people through my program, and I've got, I wouldn't say 60 ambassadors, but I've certainly got 30 ambassadors who are out there and they're looking for opportunities for Chris Spurvey. And so I get emails almost daily. Chris, this is a great prospect. This is who you should be talking to. And so I'm getting referrals now. And so a many to many is kind of the next in the kind of the line of the strategy. And then lastly, it's like stay genuine, stay authentic, stay who you are, and stay true to yourself. And so that'd be my last bit of advice for people around personal branding. And you'll find that if you follow the strategy, I believe you'll have clients knocking on your door saying, hey, I want to do business with you, instead of you having to be out there doing cold calling and all those sort of overt sales tactics and techniques that sort of goes along with the salesman personality, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, awesome. Yeah. Thank you. It's a perfect place to end. I'm going to mention your website again. I know you mentioned at the beginning. It's chrisspurvey.com, correct?
You got us.
ChrisSpurvey. Chris, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Very unique episode for us for the podcast. I think it's going to help a lot of people. It's going to give them a lot of insights and a lot to think about. So thank you for taking time to chat today.
Thanks so much, Alan. I really appreciate it. I look forward to putting your maybe around the same time. Both of our podcasts might go live the exact same time.
Let's make it happen. That sounds awesome for me. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, folks. Thanks again to Chris for doing the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Hopefully you got a lot of helpful, insightful information out of it. I know I enjoy talking to Chris. I always know that I'm going to get something insightful out of conversations that I have with him. Hopefully after listening to this, you feel the same way. Now, if you liked the episode, shoot me an email and let me know. And in fact, to show my appreciation, I'll send you a few stickers and buttons as my way of saying thanks. Just remember to include your mailing address in your email to me. You can reach me at headheartandhustle@gmail.com or through our website. You can also get email updates from us, which, I'll admit are fairly inconsistent depending on how busy my life gets. Visit headheartandhustle.com/newsletter to sign up for those. Remember that you can also find us on the web at headheartandhustle.com and on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Google+. Our logo was created by Meg Shear. If you're really enjoying that, you can check out her other work on Society 6. Just go to the site and look for Meg's stuff. The music you hear each episode was written and performed by my good friends in the band Starch to Sugar. You can check them out at starchtosugar.com or on Facebook. Lastly, if you're interested in being interviewed for a future episode of the podcast, contact me at headheartandhustle@gmail.com. As always, thanks for listening. Now, go brand yourself.